He thought he could humiliate him and prove his superiority to everyone. The kick to the face was supposed to end it all, but within seconds he realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching this video from. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows of the modest sports center, casting pale beams across the worn mats that covered the floor. The air smelled of sweat, rubber, and faintly of cleaning solution, though the scent of labor always overpowered whatever chemicals had been used earlier. The sound of bodies moving echoed in the room, the thuds of feet landing after kicks, the muffled smack of fists against heavy pads. It was a place alive with effort, but also weighed down by something more invisible, a tension that pressed down on the students who trained within its walls. The instructor moved across the mats like a general on parade, his voice sharp and cutting as he barked orders. He was a tall man, lean and muscular, with a face hardened by years of practice. His black belt swung at his waist like a badge of superiority. Every gesture was large, meant to be seen. Every command loud, meant to dominate. The students obeyed, not with eager confidence, but with nervous precision. When one of them failed to execute a technique perfectly, his voice cracked through the air like a whip. Again, if you leave your guard like that, you'll already be dead. He smirked at his own words as though he found power in the fear that crossed their young faces. A boy, no more than 15, misstepped during a basic blocking drill. The instructor pivoted quickly, slammed a stiff kick against the boy's shoulder, sending him stumbling. Laughter that wasn't laughter followed, sharp and cruel, as the man declared, "This is the difference between real fighters and amateurs." The boy swallowed his humiliation, returning to position with his eyes lowered, his arm hanging slightly from the impact. The others looked away, not daring to show sympathy. They all understood the rules of this room. To be seen caring was to be seen weak. The door at the far end of the hall opened quietly, unnoticed at first beneath the noise of drills. A man stepped inside, moving without urgency, as though the world outside had slowed for him alone. He wore faded jeans, a simple flannel shirt tucked neatly, and old cowboy boots that tapped softly on the floor. His hair carried streaks of gray, his face weathered by years under sun and strain. He could have been mistaken for a rancher, perhaps a retiree passing by who wandered in and out of curiosity. He said nothing as he crossed the threshold, merely nodded politely toward the few who glanced up before dismissing him as irrelevant. He found a seat at the edge of the room, an old wooden bench that creaked under his weight. From there he watched with calm eyes, resting his hands lightly on his knees. To the students he was just another stranger who had come to observe. His presence did not yet matter, but for him every detail mattered. He watched the way the instructor strutted, how his commands were less about correction and more about establishing dominance. He saw the way the students recoiled slightly whenever the man's gaze swept over them, how their movements carried not only tension but fear. There was no hint of judgment on his face. His eyes, pale and steady, simply absorbed what unfolded before him. Yet inside, memory stirred. He remembered his own youth, stepping barefoot onto mats in Korea, where he first learned the art that would define his life. He remembered masters who corrected mistakes with firmness, but also with respect, who taught that discipline was built on self-control, not cruelty. The sight before him was a perversion of that lesson. The man on the mat had turned teaching into tyranny. Still, the quiet visitor did not interfere. He had no desire to announce himself, no urge to make speeches. He believed in patience. He believed the truth of character revealed itself not when tested by applause, but when left alone in the silence of one's choices. So he sat back, his face unreadable, and let the scene play out. The instructor noticed him sooner than he let on. At first it was a flicker, a glance that confirmed a stranger had settled into his room. But that flicker grew into irritation as minutes passed. Who was this man, watching without permission, sitting as though he had the right to observe? There was no awe in his gaze, no fear, no recognition. The instructor thrived on being recognized. Without that, he felt small, and he despised feeling small. "Eyes forward!" he barked at a student who dared to glance toward the bench. The boy snapped his head back, flinching. The instructor's lips twisted into a smile that carried more venom than warmth. He launched into a furious demonstration, spinning into a series of kicks, each one higher, faster, more violent than the last. His heel cracked against the pad of one of his assistants with a sound that echoed through the room. "That," he boomed, "is how a true fighter shows strength. Not sloppy punches, not weak stances. Precision, power, fear." He let the last word hang like smoke, eyes cutting toward the corner where the quiet man sat. The man did not react. He leaned back slightly, his hands still folded, his face still gentle. His calm was like a mirror that refused to reflect arrogance back. The instructor felt his chest tighten with irritation. Why wasn't he intimidated? Why didn't he look away? The students, too, began to sense something. It wasn't recognition, not yet. Many were too young to know the history written on this stranger's face, but they felt the stillness, the weight in the way he occupied space. He wasn't restless, wasn't shifting in discomfort like others might have. He sat as though he had seen 1,000 such moments before and would see 1,000 more. Some of the older students, those who had watched fights late at night with their fathers or uncles, stared longer. A whisper formed, hesitant and fragile. "He looks familiar," one murmured under his breath. Another shook his head, dismissing it, but doubt lingered. The instructor sensed the whispering and mistook it for disloyalty. His eyes narrowed, and he barked an order that silenced the room instantly. "Push-ups, all of you, 20. If you think training is a time to gossip, you'll learn otherwise." The students dropped without hesitation, their palms slapping against the mats. Sweat dripped from their faces as they hurried through the punishment, their breaths ragged. The stranger's eyes softened slightly, sympathy flickering, though his expression remained otherwise unchanged. When the exercise ended, the instructor strutted again, chest puffed, his gaze landing on the stranger once more. Something in him demanded acknowledgement. Something in him screamed that this quiet man must bend, must admit weakness, must play the role the instructor assigned him. And so, though the chapter was not yet ready to close, the first seeds of confrontation had already been planted. The gym settled into silence again, the heavy kind that comes not from peace but from anticipation. The stranger in the corner simply sat, watching. The instructor walked the mats like a predator staking claim, and the students caught between fear of their teacher and a strange, growing respect for the quiet man, waited without knowing they were waiting. Something was shifting, though no one could yet name it. The sun had nearly dipped behind the rooftops when the drills wound down. The students wiped their brows, their uniforms damp and clinging to their bodies. The instructor clapped his hands sharply. "Enough! You are dismissed for now." He cast one last lingering glance at the stranger, eyes hard, daring him silently. The man in jeans did not move, did not speak, only offered the faintest nod, as though acknowledging a challenge without accepting it. And so the stage was set, though no one yet understood the story about to unfold. The quiet arrival of Chuck Norris into that small Texas gym had already disturbed the balance of power, though not with fists or force. Simply by being there, by refusing to bow to arrogance, he had drawn the line that would soon be crossed. The evening air outside darkened, and the gym buzzed with a tension that seemed alive. The first act had ended with silence, but the silence was the kind before a storm. What began as a day like any other had shifted into something else entirely, and none of them, students, instructor, or even Chuck himself, could leave unchanged once the storm finally broke. The silence that lingered after training did not bring rest to the room. The students remained scattered across the mats, stretching their sore arms and legs, while the instructor paced like a caged animal. His gaze drifted often toward the corner where the quiet man still sat. Chuck Norris had not moved since he arrived, his posture unchanged, his calm expression betraying no irritation and no fear. For the instructor, that stillness was a provocation in itself. He lived on control, on the visible acknowledgement of his authority. Every student's bowed head and cautious glance fed his pride. Yet this stranger neither bowed nor flinched, and that absence of submission began to grate on him like sand against metal. One by one, the students finished their stretches, but their eyes flickered toward the two men as though sensing something inevitable. Conversations that would normally fill the air after class were hushed, whispers carried only in glances. A boy tied his belt nervously, fumbling with the knot as his ears strained toward the silence. Another rubbed the soreness in his shoulder, still smarting from the earlier kick, and glanced at the stranger, his eyes wide with a kind of hope he could not explain. Something was shifting, though no one dared name it. The instructor finally stopped his pacing. He folded his arms across his chest, his black belt hanging at his waist like a declaration of power. Then, with deliberate loudness, he turned his head toward the stranger and said, "You've been sitting there long enough. What do you see? A free show?" His words cut the air. A few of the younger students froze mid-motion, caught between curiosity and fear. Chuck lifted his eyes, calm as before, and answered in a voice so even it sounded like a counterweight to the sharpness hurled at him. "I see young people working hard. They deserve encouragement." The students blinked. No one spoke to their instructor that way, at least not without suffering the sting of humiliation that followed. The instructor's jaw tightened, though he laughed, a short, harsh sound meant to belittle. "Encouragement," he repeated. "Discipline isn't encouragement. Fear makes a fighter strong. If you don't fear, you don't survive. That's what I teach." Chuck did not argue. He inclined his head slightly, the way a man might acknowledge an opinion without adopting it. His silence felt heavier than words. It suggested he had heard such declarations many times before and found them unworthy of contest. The instructor's pride prickled. He stepped closer, his bare feet pressing hard against the mats. His voice grew louder, meant for every ear in the room. "And you? You sit there in your boots and jeans, looking like you wandered in from the street. What do you know about discipline? About fighting?" His tone was mocking now, each word sharpened to cut. Some of the students looked down, their stomachs tight with dread. Others glanced furtively at Chuck, as if pleading with him to ignore the insult. A few, the ones who recognized his face, sat rigid with shock, hardly daring to breathe. They knew the truth but could not bring themselves to speak it aloud. How could they explain to their teacher that the man he mocked had fought in arenas watched by millions, had trained in disciplines deeper than the arrogance of any single black belt? Chuck's voice broke the tension again, still calm, still even. "I don't wish to argue, I only came to observe. Your students are trying their best. That's worth recognizing." The instructor's smile spread into a sneer. He turned to the room, addressing not just the stranger, but his audience of impressionable students. "You hear that? He thinks your mistakes are worth celebrating. He thinks weakness deserves praise." He laughed again, and his laughter echoed hollow against the walls. Then his eyes sharpened, his gaze returning to Chuck with the weight of a challenge. "If you know so much, why don't you prove it? Get on the mat. Show us what encouragement can do." The room fell silent. A girl's hand paused mid-motion as she gathered her gear. A boy's breath caught in his throat. The sound of the fluorescent light buzzing overhead seemed suddenly too loud, too present. Chuck shook his head. "I'm not here to spare," he said gently. "I'm here only to watch." The refusal, spoken without apology, was more than the instructor could tolerate. To him, every quiet word sounded like condescension. His pride burned at the idea that this stranger could deny him a contest, deny him the opportunity to prove superiority in front of his students. His voice dropped lower, heavier, each word laced with venom. "Not here to spar, or too afraid to lose?" A ripple of discomfort spread among the students. One of them, a boy who had endured the brunt of the instructor's harshness earlier, bit his lip to keep from speaking out. Another shook his head almost imperceptibly, silently urging the stranger not to take the bait. But in the silence that followed, the challenge grew heavier, a weight pressing on every chest in the room. Chuck's eyes did not harden, his expression did not shift. He simply offered a small, patient smile, as though the insult was a breeze passing against a mountain. "Fear is natural," he said quietly, "but it's not what defines a fighter." The instructor bristled. His students' eyes were no longer entirely fixed on him. Some were drawn to the calm certainty in the stranger's words, that more than anything felt like betrayal. His voice rose, cutting into the air with all the force of command. "Enough talk! If you're not afraid, stand up. Show them what you've got, or admit you're only here to watch real fighters." The challenge had become a demand. No longer was it a matter of pride alone. It was now a spectacle, a theater of humiliation the instructor sought to stage. He expected the man in the corner to decline again, to retreat and expose himself as weak before the students. But Chuck remained seated, steady as ever. His silence stretched, and the longer it lingered, the more uncomfortable the room became. Finally he spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried to every ear. Strength isn't proven by who can shout the loudest. True strength shows in patience. His words fell like stones into water, sending ripples across the silence. Some students looked down, shaken. Others met his gaze with wide eyes, their respect swelling despite themselves. Even those who had no idea who he truly was felt something stirring, something that contradicted everything their instructor had been drilling into them. The instructor clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. He felt the authority slipping, the control unraveling. And control was his lifeblood. He could not allow it. He stepped forward again, his voice snapping like a whip. "I'll say it once more. Stand up, prove yourself, or admit to everyone here that you're nothing but a coward." The words hung like poison in the air. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The students barely breathed, caught between dread and anticipation. The stranger's stillness was unbearable, yet magnetic. And then slowly, Chuck rose from the bench. He did not move abruptly, did not rise like a man provoked to anger. He simply stood, as though stretching legs that had been too long at rest. His smile remained, gentle and unchanged. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The students leaned forward, hearts pounding. The instructor's chest swelled, convinced he had drawn the man into his trap. Chuck bowed his head slightly toward him, his voice soft but steady. "I meant no challenge," he said, "but if this is what you wish, then we will see." The storm had been invited. The next step would no longer be about words, but about the truth revealed when fists and feet meet flesh. The tension that had simmered since Chuck entered the gym now surged, uncontainable, pulling every eye, every breath, toward the confrontation about to ignite. The air in the gym seemed to thicken as Chuck stepped away from the bench and onto the mats. His movements were unhurried, lacking any sense of theatricality, yet each step carried weight. The students instinctively held their breath as they watched him take his place opposite the instructor. The man in the black belt stood tall, his chest heaving with anticipation, his smirk curling in triumph as though he had already won before the first move was made. He stretched his legs with exaggerated force, the crack of his joints echoing as he snapped into his stance, ready to showcase his power before the stranger, and more importantly, his audience. Chuck simply loosened his shoulders, his body relaxed, his expression unchanging. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man standing casually, almost unprepared. But the sharpest among the students noticed something different in the set of his frame, in the way his eyes seemed to focus without narrowing, how he stood not as prey awaiting a strike, but as a mountain unmoved by the weather. The instructor barked, "Ready?" His voice carried arrogance, daring his opponent to answer. Chuck inclined his head. "If you wish." The first attack came like lightning. The instructor lunged forward, his bare feet slapping against the mat as his fists sliced through the air. He followed with a flurry of kicks, spinning and snapping with precision that rattled the onlookers. His strikes were fast, honed by years of drilling, and he unleashed them with the reckless aggression of a man determined not just to fight, but to humiliate. Chuck barely moved. He shifted his weight by inches, turned his head the smallest fraction, and the blows slid past him as though they had been aimed at shadows. His boots seemed rooted, yet his body flowed like water around each strike. To the students, it was disorienting. One moment they saw the instructor's heel cutting toward Chuck's ribs. The next it was sliding harmlessly past empty space. Chuck's face never changed. His eyes stayed calm, his breathing steady, as though he were walking through nothing more dangerous than morning mist. Frustration flickered across the instructor's features. He snapped a sharp kick to the body, only to meet air. He swung an elbow with vicious force, but Chuck leaned back, letting it pass a hair's breadth from his nose. The room filled with gasps each time the strike missed. The students leaned forward, their eyes wide, unable to comprehend how the stranger evaded without effort. Some whispered, "How is he doing that?" Others stared, speechless, as though watching an illusion unravel before them. The instructor's pride flared hotter with every miss. He was not accustomed to being toyed with, to having his power rendered meaningless by a man who moved so little. His strikes grew faster, more desperate, his breath ragged as he poured energy into each attack. Still, Chuck was untouchable, his posture unshaken, his composure intact. And then it happened. The instructor leapt, twisting his body in a display meant to end the farce once and for all. His leg whipped around in a full spinning kick, his heel cutting a sharp arc through the air. This was no half-hearted strike. This was the technique he prided himself on, the move he had used countless times to drop sparring partners with bone-jarring force. His heel connected squarely with Chuck's face. The sound was sickening, a crack that made every student in the room flinch as if the blow had landed on them instead. For a heartbeat, the room froze. The instructor landed lightly, a victorious grin spreading across his face. The silence was filled with the echo of that impact, the unspoken belief that the fight had already ended. The students' stomachs knotted in dread. They saw the man in jeans take the full brunt of the strike. No one could stand after that, not even him. But Chuck did. He did not stumble, did not collapse. He straightened slowly, lifted a hand to wipe the trickle of sweat and faint redness from his cheek, and then smiled. Not a smirk, not a grin of superiority, but the same gentle, patient smile he had carried since entering the gym. His eyes found the instructor's, calm and unwavering, and he spoke with a softness that sliced deeper than any insult. "Good kick." The words hit the instructor harder than any strike could have. His smirk faltered, his chest constricting as disbelief clawed at him. He had landed the very blow that defined him, the strike he believed no one could withstand, and the man before him treated it as nothing more than a nudge. The students gasped in unison, their awe shifting swiftly into shock. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered frantically, their eyes darting between Chuck's face and the instructor's paling features. The silence after Chuck's compliment was unbearable. It pressed against the walls thick and heavy until the instructor broke it with a roar. He lunged again, unleashing another cascade of kicks and punches, his movements a storm of fury. But something had changed. His strikes, though still powerful, no longer carried certainty. They were wild, desperate, each one less controlled than the last. Chuck moved, not with force, not with the aggression expected, but with speed so blinding the students blinked and missed it. His fist tapped against the instructor's guard left, right, right. So fast the sound became a blur. He circled around him, light touches brushing his shoulders, his ribs, his back, each one a demonstration of precision. The instructor tried to block, to counter, but it was like trying to swat shadows with bare hands. The stranger's movements were too fast, too refined, too controlled. And then, just as quickly as it began, Chuck stopped. He stepped back, lowered his hands and bowed slightly, his voice calm. "See, strength can hurt, or it can teach. The choice is ours." The instructor froze, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his limbs heavy as lead. Sweat poured down his face, his pride splintering under the weight of what he had just experienced. He dropped to his knees not from pain, but from the realization that his arrogance had been dismantled without violence, without cruelty, but with mastery beyond comprehension. The students erupted in whispers, some clutching at each other in disbelief. He didn't even try. He could have destroyed him. This is real mastery. Their voices swelled, all replacing the fear that had filled them moments before. The instructor's eyes watered, his throat tight as he whispered, I don't understand." Chuck approached, his steps measured, his presence not threatening but steady. He knelt beside the man who had moments earlier tried to humiliate him, and with the same patience he had shown all evening, he rested a hand on his shoulder. "Strength is not in how hard you strike," he said gently. "It's in how well you control it." The instructor bowed his head, trembling. His body buzzed with adrenaline, but his pride lay shattered at his feet. The lesson had been delivered, not in pain, but in mercy. And though he struggled to accept it, though his heart fought against the humility forced upon him, deep down he knew. He had just been given a gift, a truth he had never been willing to face. The students stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the two men. The storm they had sensed had broken, and its aftermath left the air heavy with revelation. They had seen arrogance struck down not by rage, but by grace. And in the center of the mats, a black belt who had once thrived on fear now knelt before the man he had mocked, his world upended in the span of a few heartbeats. The fight was over, though few would call it a fight. It was something else, something larger, something that would stay with every person in that gym long after the mats had cooled and the echoes of their whispers had faded. And as Chuck helped the man back to his feet, the next lesson, deeper than any strike or block, waited in the silence between them. The gym was still vibrating with the echoes of what had just taken place. The students stood frozen in the aftermath, their eyes darting between the humbled instructor on his knees and the man who had dismantled him with nothing more than speed, precision, and restraint. The strike that had seemed to seal the contest, the spinning heel kick to the face, had turned into nothing more than a momentary ripple against the calm surface of Chuck Norris. The younger boys and girls who had been convinced their teacher's dominance was unshakable now looked at him with uncertainty and then back to Chuck with something far more powerful than fear: reverence. Chuck did not bask in it. He did not seek their admiration or let the hush of awe linger around him like a crown. Instead, he stepped back, his arms at his sides, his chest rising and falling with the same controlled rhythm it had carried from the first moment he entered. He had moved through a storm of aggression and come out the other side without even raising his voice. The demonstration was finished, but the lesson had only begun. The instructor pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. His body was drenched in sweat, his hair clinging to his forehead, his breathing heavy. He looked around the room and saw the eyes of his students no longer filled with the usual fear. It struck him like a blade, carving at the foundation of his authority. His voice, hoarse but still tinged with pride, tried to recover what was lost. Words. Words are nothing, he spat. Here, only strength matters. Yet even as he said it, his tone betrayed doubt. Chuck tilted his head, studying him with the quiet patience of a man who had heard that argument too many times. He did not interrupt, nor did he counter with boasts. He simply let silence answer for him, and the silence carried a weight heavier than any fist. The instructor clenched his fists, shaking as he tried to reclaim his image. But in the faces of his students, he saw the collapse of the illusion he had built over years. Then Chuck moved again, not with aggression, but with purpose. His steps were slow, his gaze gentle, and when he spoke, his voice was steady enough to still the buzzing lights above them. Strength without humility is dangerous, he said. His words were not directed only at the man before him, but to every young ear in the room. You've trained for years, I can see that. Your kicks are sharp, your speed is real. But all that power, what does it bring if it only leaves fear behind? The students leaned in. No one dared shift or fidget. They knew instinctively that something more important than training drills or sparring matches was unfolding. The instructor opened his mouth to reply but found no words. For the first time in front of his pupils, he faltered. His eyes lowered briefly, and in that instant, his vulnerability was laid bare. Chuck continued, his voice neither condemning nor mocking. Fear can push someone for a day, but encouragement can carry them for a lifetime. I saw the boy you struck earlier. He has heart, but fear makes him smaller. Your job as a teacher is not to make them afraid, it's to help them grow. His eyes shifted to the boy, who stood at the back with trembling hands, stunned that someone had spoken for him. The boy's chest lifted, just a little, as though a weight had been taken off. The instructor swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his heart pounding with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. His pride fought to rise again, to retort, to dismiss. But something inside him quivered, something he had buried long ago under layers of dominance and control. He remembered, though he did not want to, the first days when he had walked barefoot into a dojo as a scrawny boy, desperate to escape the cruelty of the world outside. He remembered the nights scrubbing floors in exchange for lessons, the first time his master had placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he had potential. Respect had lifted him then, not fear. But over the years, the pain of the past had hardened him, reshaped that memory into something twisted. His voice cracked as he tried to speak. I wasn't born strong. My father left when I was young. My mother worked herself sick. There were days when there was no food. Kids laughed at me, mocked me. They beat me until I couldn't stand. When I found martial arts, I swore I would never be weak again. His confession spilled out, raw and trembling, as though Chuck's calm gaze had torn open the walls he had spent a lifetime fortifying. The students were silent, their eyes wide. They had never heard their teacher speak this way, had never glimpsed the boy behind the black belt. His fists trembled at his sides as he went on. At first it was survival. I cleaned, I studied, I fought, and it saved me. But then I saw how people looked at me when I won, how they bowed lower, how they obeyed quicker when I barked. I started to like it. Respect came faster when they were afraid. And I didn't want to be laughed at anymore. His voice faded. The students shifted uncomfortably, their faces reflecting the truth he had tried to hide. They had not respected him all these years. They had feared him. That realization tore at him more deeply than any strike could. He looked around and saw it clearly now, written in their lowered eyes, their stiff shoulders, their hesitance to speak. They had never admired him. They had only obeyed. Chuck's voice came again, soft but piercing. You turned your pain into strength. That's something I understand. But somewhere along the way, you let that pain become your teacher instead of your discipline. True respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from what you give, not what you take. The instructor's breath hitched. He felt naked before his students, exposed in ways he had never imagined. Pride tried to claw back, whispering that he could still fight, that he could still prove himself with force. But pride was failing him. It had failed him the moment his heel struck Chuck's face, and the man smiled instead of crumbling. The room remained hushed, every pair of eyes locked on the two men. Even the buzzing of the lights seemed muted now. The instructor wanted to deny it, wanted to claim strength above all, but when he tried to form the words, they tasted like ash. His smirk had vanished, his face damp with sweat and shame. He sank slowly back to his knees, not from defeat in battle, but from the weight of revelation. Chuck stood above him, not looming, not domineering, but present. He extended a hand, not to push him down further, but to lift him if he chose. We all have battles, Chuck said gently, but the question is, do we fight to lift only ourselves, or do we fight to lift others too? The words washed over the room, heavy and cleansing. The students stood in stunned silence, their hearts pounding with something they could not quite name. They had expected a fight, a display of violence, a clash of egos. Instead, they had witnessed something else, something deeper. They had seen humility dismantle arrogance, and now they watched as pride cracked open to reveal vulnerability beneath. The instructor lowered his head, tears blurring his vision. He could not yet find the strength to answer. But for the first time in years, the shield of his dominance had fallen away, and in its place was something raw, human, and unfinished. And as the silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths, the lesson was clear. The fight was no longer about fists and kicks. It had become about the heart, about the kind of strength that endures long after the mats are empty. The students would never forget it, and neither would their teacher, whose journey had only just begun. The stillness that followed the instructor's confession hung over the room like heavy smoke, difficult to breathe through and impossible to ignore. His students, who had only ever seen him as a towering figure of dominance, now looked at him with conflicted eyes. Some felt pity, others confusion, but most simply struggled to reconcile the man they feared with the broken voice that had just confessed weakness. The mats beneath them seemed to echo with the weight of years that had just been unspooled in a few trembling sentences. Chuck remained where he was, standing with the same calm posture that had carried him through every stage of this strange encounter. His expression had not hardened, nor had it softened into pity. It stayed steady, the kind of expression one might expect from a man who had listened to many confessions in his life and understood that what mattered was not the fall, but what came after. The instructor, still kneeling, lifted his face slightly as though waiting for judgment. "You could have destroyed me," he whispered hoarsely. His voice trembled and his hands balled into fists, not in defiance but in shame. "When I kicked you, when I gave everything I had, you could have ended me right there. Why didn't you?" The students leaned closer, breathless. This was a question they themselves carried but dared not ask. Chuck crouched slightly so that his eyes were level with the man's, his movements unhurried, his presence unthreatening. "Because if I had done that," he said, his voice steady, "you would have learned nothing. Humiliation doesn't teach. Pain doesn't heal. Only understanding does." The words fell quietly, but they struck harder than any punch. The instructor lowered his eyes again, unable to hold Chuck's gaze for long. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, the sweat on his skin cooling under the flickering lights. He had spent years building his image on the foundation of fear, had convinced himself that it was respect. And in a single hour, a man who had not even raised his fists in anger had shattered that illusion completely. The students began to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying a new tone, one not of dread but of revelation. "He didn't even try. He was holding back. This is what real strength looks like." Their whispers swelled like waves crashing against the walls of the gym, and each word felt like a blow against the crumbling pride of their instructor. He looked at them, saw in their eyes not the usual flinch of submission, but something different, something brighter. It was respect, but not for him. For the man who had walked in quietly, sat without announcement, and only now revealed what mastery truly meant. The instructor swallowed hard. He wanted to resist, to shout, to demand their loyalty again, but the truth was too clear, and his voice betrayed him when he tried. "All these years," he muttered, his throat thick, "I thought I was teaching them discipline. I thought I was making them strong, but I was only teaching them fear." Chuck rested a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm, guiding him back up to his feet. "Discipline without respect becomes cruelty," he said, "and strength without compassion becomes emptiness. You still have the choice to change." The instructor looked at him, bewildered. "Change? After all this? After what I've done to them?" His voice cracked, nearly breaking. He gestured toward the rows of young faces, some wide-eyed, some tearful, all of them watching. "They'll never forgive me." But to his surprise, a small voice spoke from the back. It was the boy who had been struck earlier, the one whose shoulder still ached from the heavy kick. He stepped forward hesitantly, his belt tied unevenly, his face flushed with nerves. I forgive you, Sensei," he said softly. The words trembled in the air, fragile but real. The instructor blinked, his mouth opening as though to protest, but the boy continued, finding courage in his own voice. "I was afraid of you. Every day I came here, I trained because I didn't want to make you angry. But when he pointed at Chuck, when he said I had potential, I believed him. For the first time. If you can be like that, I'll follow you. Not because I'm afraid, because I want to." The gym erupted in whispers again, softer this time, more like the stirring of leaves than crashing waves. The other students nodded slowly, some wiping their eyes, others stepping closer. The atmosphere shifted, no longer heavy with dread, but alive with possibility. The instructor's chest heaved. He looked at the boy, then at the others, and finally back at Chuck. His voice cracked as he whispered, "They don't admire me. They never did." Chuck shook his head gently. "They can, but admiration is not taken. It's earned, and it's never too late to start." The words seemed to cut through the fog in the instructor's mind. He pressed his palms together and bowed low before Chuck, his forehead nearly touching the mat. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice loud enough now for all to hear. "Respect is not something you demand. It's something you live. Forgive me." The students gasped softly, never having seen their teacher bow to anyone. Chuck, however, did not revel in the gesture. He bent down, touched the man's arm, and guided him back up once more. "Forgiveness is not mine to give," he said. "It's theirs. But the lesson, if you live it, they will see, and they will follow." The instructor's lips trembled. He turned to his students, his eyes heavy with tears he could no longer hold back. I thought strength meant making you fear me, but today I learned it only made me smaller. From now on, I will be different. I promise you." The students exchanged glances, and one by one they stepped forward. Not all at once, not with loud declarations, but with quiet nods and small steps, their trust beginning to rebuild itself piece by piece. The boy who had spoken earlier approached his teacher and bowed. The instructor bent down and hugged him, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." Chuck watched silently, his presence still and steady. He did not need to say more. His role was not to claim victory, but to allow transformation to happen. And it was happening right there on the mats that had once been filled with fear, but now carried the weight of something new. The silence that followed was not suffocating like before. It was cleansing, like rain after a long drought. The students felt it, the instructor felt it, and Chuck knew it too. Something had shifted permanently. Pride had been broken, and in its place, humility had begun to grow. For the instructor, it was the most painful lesson of his life. But as he looked at his students, seeing in their eyes not fear, but hope, he understood it was also the most important. And for Chuck, it was enough. He had not come to teach, nor to fight, nor to expose. Yet by simply being who he was, he had changed the course of this small gym forever. The fight was finished, the arrogance undone, but the true battle, the battle for humility and respect, was only beginning. The gym was hushed again, though now the silence no longer felt like dread. It was the silence of reflection, the pause after something immense had shifted. The instructor remained on his knees, his head bowed low, not in defiance this time, but in genuine humility. His words from moments before still hung in the air, echoing softly in every heart present. He had admitted he had been wrong, admitted that his methods had been built on fear rather than respect. For years, the students had carried that weight in their training, and now it seemed to lift, replaced by something new. The students stood in a loose circle around the mats, their faces a mixture of astonishment and relief. They had never expected to witness their teacher unravel before them, nor to see a stranger walk in and in less than an hour reveal truths that years of lessons had not. Some of them were still trying to process what had happened, blinking rapidly as if to be sure they were not dreaming. Others watched Chuck with wide eyes, their admiration for him now overflowing, not only for his skill, but for his composure, his patience, the grace with which he had handled everything. The instructor raised his head slowly, his eyes red and wet, his voice thick when he spoke. "Forgive me," he said again, this time to the students directly. "I thought I was teaching you discipline. I thought I was preparing you for a hard world. But I see now, all I was doing was making you afraid. I let my own pain blind me. I let my pride guide me instead of my honor. That ends today." His words broke apart at the edges, but their sincerity was undeniable. A young girl, no more than 12, stepped forward hesitantly. Her voice was small but clear. "We were afraid, Sensei," she admitted, "but we wanted to learn. We wanted to be strong. If you change, if you teach us the way he teaches," she looked toward Chuck, "we'll follow you." The instructor's lips trembled, and he bent his head again, overwhelmed by the grace his students were extending him. He had expected hatred, rejection, perhaps even desertion. Instead, he found forgiveness beginning to take root in the very faces he had once ruled with fear. A sob escaped him before he could stop it, and he pressed a hand against his eyes. Chuck stepped forward, not to claim the moment, but to ground it. His presence was steady, his voice calm as he addressed the room. "Remember this," he said, his gaze sweeping across each of the young faces. "Never confuse fear with respect. Fear fades. Respect endures. And respect is not about making others bow. It is about lifting them when they are down, about giving them strength when they have none." His words carried a clarity that made them feel etched into the very walls of the gym. The instructor turned toward him, his voice raw. "Why? Why show me this mercy? After everything I said, after the way I mocked you, why not humiliate me? You had every chance." Chuck met his eyes, his expression unchanging. "Because a fight isn't about proving who is better. It's about growth. If I had won and you had learned nothing, then both of us would have lost. But if you rise from this stronger, Wiser, then we both win. The room was utterly silent. The students absorbed every syllable, their hearts pounding with the weight of what they had just witnessed. They were not watching a spar anymore, nor a battle of egos. They were watching a transformation, and it would be one they carried with them long after. The instructor bowed deeply, not out of forced tradition, but from gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "You've given me back something I lost a long time ago." Chuck placed a hand on his shoulder again, grounding him. "Strength is a gift," he said softly, "but it is wasted if it's used only to lift ourselves. True strength is lifting others, even when the world tells you not to." The students, unable to contain themselves, began to clap. It wasn't the loud, frantic clapping of a crowd at a spectacle, but a slow, reverent sound, each pair of hands joining in as if acknowledging not a victory, but a revelation. Some of the children's eyes shone with tears. Others smiled in a way they hadn't smiled inside this gym in years. For them, the place that had always been filled with tension now felt different. It felt lighter, freer, like a home rather than a cage. The instructor turned back to his students, his voice still shaky but firmer now, with newfound resolve. "I was blind," he said. "I thought I was teaching you honor, but I was only teaching you fear. That ends today. From now on, we will train with respect, with patience, with kindness. I promise you this." His words were not the barks of command they were used to, but a pledge, fragile and sincere. The boy who had been humiliated earlier, the one Chuck had defended, stepped forward again. His shoulder was still sore, but his spirit had risen. He looked at his teacher with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Sensei." For the first time in years, the instructor smiled, not the smirk of arrogance, but a genuine, humble smile. Chuck gave the boy an encouraging nod, then looked back at the circle of students. His presence filled the space not with dominance, but with calm assurance. "Never judge someone by how they look," he said, "and never let pride blind you. Humility will take you further than any punch or kick ever will." His words were not just advice, but a charge, one that sank into every listening heart. The instructor bowed his head once more, his hands pressed together in front of him. The students bowed with him, not because they were commanded to, but because they wanted to. It was no longer fear that bent their backs, but respect born not from dominance, but from the example they had just witnessed. Chuck looked around the gym one last time. He saw the tears drying on young faces, the softened eyes of a man who had once been hardened by arrogance, the collective spirit of a group transformed. He knew his work here was done. Without fanfare, without another word, he stepped back toward the bench where he had first sat. He picked up his jacket, slung it over his arm, and moved quietly toward the door. As he reached it, he turned his head slightly, offering one final glance. His smile was gentle, steady, the same smile that had carried him through the entire encounter. Then he pushed the door open and stepped into the evening, the light outside spilling briefly across the mats before fading as the door closed. For a long moment, no one moved. The gym, once a place of tension and fear, now felt sacred. The instructor remained standing at the front, humbled but not broken, ready to rebuild. The students looked at him differently now, not as someone untouchable, but as someone who could change, who could grow alongside them. And though the stranger had left, his words lingered like a quiet echo. Strength without compassion is empty. Humility is the true mark of a warrior. That night, as the students filed out one by one, they carried more than sore muscles and sweat on their uniforms. They carried a memory, a lesson, a truth. They had seen what real mastery looked like, and it would shape them long after the mats were rolled up and the lights turned off. For the instructor, it was not the end of his story, but the beginning of another, one no longer written in arrogance and fear, but in humility and respect. And for Chuck, who had come in quietly and left the same way, it was simply another day, another chance to remind the world that greatness does not roar at whispers, and those who are willing to listen are forever changed. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. There are even more powerful stories waiting for you. Click here to watch the next video right now. And don't keep this lesson to yourself. Share this video with your friends so they can feel it too.